May 28, 1944, a young American private named Jack Maisie stood in a muddy field in southeast England, gripping a rope attached to what looked like a 30-ton Sherman tank. With three other soldiers, he lifted the massive war machine over his head with one hand. It wasn't magic, it wasn't superhuman strength, it was rubber and air, and it was about to change the course of the war. As dawn broke over the English countryside, Jack and 1,100 other men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, known as the Ghost Army, prepared to execute the most audacious military deception in human history. Their mission defied every conventional wisdom about warfare. They would defeat the enemy not with bullets, but with lies, not with force, but with illusion. While 150,000 real Allied soldiers prepared to storm the beaches of Normandy, Jack's unit would create an entire phantom army, complete with inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, and fake radio transmissions, all designed to convince Hitler's command that the invasion would strike 200 miles away at Pas-de-Calais. The counterintuitive truth that would determine D-Day's success was this: to save thousands of real soldiers, they first had to create thousands of fake ones. To win the war's most critical battle, they had to master the art of not being there at all. Every instinct in military doctrine screamed that strength came from massing forces at the point of attack. But Operation Fortitude proved something that defied centuries of military tradition. Sometimes the most powerful army is the one that doesn't exist. Jack Maisie had been recruited not for his combat skills, but for his peacetime profession. He was an art student from New York, trained in design and visual deception. The Ghost Army actively sought artists, architects, actors, and advertising professionals, people whose entire careers had been built on creating convincing illusions. They were given an impossible task: make the Germans believe that General George Patton, Hitler's most feared Allied commander, was amassing a force of 150,000 men for an assault across the narrowest point of the English Channel. The catch was that Patton's army, the First United States Army Group, didn't exist. It was entirely fictional. Every tank was inflatable. Every plane was plywood. Every radio transmission was theater. And the fate of the free world depended on this performance being absolutely convincing. As Jack inflated another rubber Sherman tank that morning, German reconnaissance planes circled overhead, cameras clicking, gathering intelligence that would reach Hitler's desk within hours. The deception had to be perfect because the cost of failure was unthinkable. If the Germans discovered the real invasion point at Normandy, they could mass their panzer divisions and turn the beaches into a slaughterhouse. Operation Overlord, the actual D-Day invasion, would fail. The war could be lost. Everything hinged on whether artists with air compressors could fool the most sophisticated military intelligence apparatus in the world. The origins of Operation Fortitude stretched back to the scorching deserts of North Africa in 1942, where British forces under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery faced Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps at El Alamein. British deception units, inspired by stage magician Jasper Maskelyne, created dummy tanks from plywood and canvas to mislead German aerial reconnaissance. They built fake supply depots. They positioned inflatable artillery. The Germans fell for it completely, concentrating forces in the wrong sectors while Montgomery struck where they were weakest. The British victory at El Alamein proved that visual deception could work on a massive scale. American military planners Ralph Ingersoll and Billy Harris saw the reports from North Africa and recognized revolutionary potential. If illusion could win a battle, could it win the entire European theater? By January 1944, They had received authorization to create the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a 1,100-man unit whose sole purpose was tactical deception. Colonel Harry L. Reeder was appointed commander, and recruitment began with unusual criteria. Instead of visiting military bases, recruiters went to art schools in New York and Philadelphia. They needed creative minds who could think outside conventional military doctrine. The men who answered the call included Bill Blass, who would become a famous fashion designer, Ellsworth Kelly, who would revolutionize modern art, Arthur Singer, who would become America's foremost wildlife painter. These were not typical soldiers. They were dreamers, creators, people trained to manipulate perception. At Camp Forest in Tennessee, then at Camp Pine in New York, these artist soldiers underwent training that was unlike any other military preparation. They learned how to inflate rubber tanks using portable air compressors, a process that took 4 men about 15 minutes per tank. They practiced setting up dummy airfields, complete with plywood aircraft, positioned on fake runways. They studied the technical specifications of real military equipment so their fakes would match exact dimensions and shadows when photographed from reconnaissance altitude. But the most sophisticated element wasn't visual at all. It was sonic. Working with engineers from Bell Labs, the 3132 Signal Service Company Special traveled to Fort Knox to record actual sounds of armored divisions, tank engines roaring, artillery pieces firing, trucks moving in convoy, soldiers shouting commands. These sounds were recorded onto state-of-the-art wire recorders, then played back through powerful amplifiers and speakers mounted on half-tracks. The sonic deceptions could be heard 15 miles away. A German listening post would hear what sounded like an entire armored division preparing for assault, when in reality it was just a handful of men playing records. The third layer of deception was perhaps the most technically challenging: radio deception, or spoof radio. The signal company special trained operators to mimic the unique Morse code fist of actual radio operators from real units. Every telegraph operator has an individual style, a rhythm and timing as distinctive as a fingerprint. Military intelligence analysts were trained to identify units by recognizing their operators' fists. The Ghost Army operators studied departed units' transmission patterns and replicated them so perfectly that German intelligence believed the real units were still in position when they had actually moved to Normandy staging areas. It was thought impossible to fake an operator's fist, but the Ghost Army did it. In early May 1944, the entire unit shipped to England and established headquarters near Stratford-upon-Avon, Shakespeare's birthplace. The irony wasn't lost on the educated artists in the ranks. They were modern players on history's greatest stage, performing a drama where all the world literally was watching. They immediately joined Operation Fortitude, the British-designed deception plan to convince German high command that the D-Day invasion target was Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. The strategic logic was impeccable. Pas-de-Calais was the obvious choice, just 21 miles across the channel from Dover, the shortest route to France. It was also the most direct path to Germany. If the Allies convinced Hitler that Patton was preparing to strike there, German reinforcements would remain in the wrong location even after the real invasion began at Normandy. The Phantom Army that Jack Mazey and his fellow Ghost Army soldiers constructed in the spring of 1944 was staggering in its scope and detail. In fields across southeast England, hundreds of inflatable Sherman tanks appeared in precise military formations from 20,000 feet, where German reconnaissance aircraft operated. These rubber decoys were indistinguishable from actual 30-ton combat vehicles. The Ghost Army positioned them in staging areas with appropriate spacing, added tire tracks in the mud using real vehicles driven in patterns, and even hung laundry on clotheslines near fake barracks to suggest human habitation. Nothing was left to chance. The visual deception extended to the coastline, where the greatest trick of all was being prepared. Film technicians from Shepperton Studios, the same artists who created movie magic for British cinema, were enlisted to build an entire fake invasion fleet. They constructed 250 landing craft from canvas stretched over wooden frames floating on empty oil drums. From aerial reconnaissance, these appeared to be genuine LCT landing craft. They were positioned in harbors along the southeast coast, directly across from Pas-de-Calais, suggesting that the invasion force was assembling for the shortest channel crossing. Near Dover, an elaborate fake oil depot was constructed using wooden boards, scaffolding, and old sewer pipes salvaged from London bomb sites. From ground level, it looked absurdly fake, but from reconnaissance altitude, it appeared to be a massive fuel supply facility, exactly what would be needed to supply Patton's Phantom Army Group after it landed in France. German photo analysts studied aerial images of these installations and concluded they were genuine. Their reports went up the chain of command to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and ultimately to Hitler himself. The Führer became convinced that Pas-de-Calais was the target, but creating visual evidence wasn't enough. The deception had to be layered, had to come from multiple intelligence sources, because German intelligence would cross-reference visual reconnaissance with signals intelligence, human intelligence, and radio traffic analysis. Every source had to tell the same false story. The Ghost Army's sonic deception units went to work creating the soundscape of a massive military buildup. On carefully chosen nights when atmospheric conditions would carry sound toward known German listening posts, they would set up their sonic equipment and broadcast the sounds of armor concentrations, infantry movements, and engineering operations. A German intelligence officer listening through headphones would hear tank engines, shouting sergeants, the metallic clanking of treads on pavement, all the auditory signatures of mechanized divisions preparing for combat. He would dutifully file reports confirming that massive forces were gathering in southeast England. The radio deception was equally sophisticated. Ghost Army operators created entire phantom command structures on the airwaves. They sent routine traffic between fictional headquarters units. They used proper radio protocols, authentic code words, and replicated the transmission patterns of real divisions. German signals intelligence units intercepted these transmissions and concluded they were monitoring Patton's 1st United States Army Group preparing for the Pas-de-Calais invasion. But the masterpiece of the deception involved a real German general being used as an unwitting double agent. In late May 1944, General Hans Kramer was released from Allied custody in a prisoner exchange. Before his repatriation, British intelligence drove him through southern England in what they claimed was the Pas-de-Calais staging area. In reality, they drove him through Kent and Sussex, where the real D-Day invasion forces were actually assembling. But they changed all the road signs. They had a corporal in the car constantly make casual references to locations in southeast England. They made Kramer believe he was touring the area across from Pas-de-Calais when he was actually seeing the real Normandy invasion preparations. When Kramer returned to Germany, he rushed to his old friend, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was commanding German forces in France, and reported with absolute certainty, "The invasion is coming at Pas-de-Calais. I've seen it with my own eyes. Patton has assembled a massive force." Rommel believed him because Kramer was a trusted general with no reason to lie. He wasn't lying. He had been deceived by one of the most brilliant psychological operations in military history. The final element involved General George S. Patton himself. The Germans believed Patton was the Allies' finest commander. Hitler personally feared him more than any other Allied general. German intelligence doctrine held that wherever Patton was positioned, that was where the main attack would come. So the Allies made sure Patton was visible in southeast England, touring the fake installations, being photographed near Dover, making public appearances that German agents would report. In reality, Patton had no operational command. He was window dressing, the star of the show, his presence the ultimate proof that Pas-de-Calais was the target. By June 5th, 1944, the night before D-Day, German High Command was absolutely convinced the invasion would strike Pas-de-Calais. They had visual confirmation from aerial reconnaissance. They had sonic confirmation from listening posts. They had signals intelligence from radio intercepts. They had human intelligence from General Kramer, and they had Patton's presence as the ultimate indicator. Every intelligence source told the same story. It was all theater, all illusion, all lies, and it was perfect. June 6th, 1944, 06:30 hours. The real invasion struck Normandy. 150,000 Allied soldiers stormed 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The largest amphibious assault in military history was underway. And in German headquarters at Pas-de-Calais, 200 miles away, Field Marshal von Rundstedt kept his panzer divisions waiting for the real invasion that would never come. The deception worked beyond the Allies' most optimistic projections, even as American soldiers fought and died on Omaha Beach, even as British forces pushed inland from Gold and Sword, even as the true scale of the Normandy operation became undeniable. Hitler refused to commit his reserves. He remained convinced that Normandy was a feint, diversionary attack to draw forces away from Pas-de-Calais, where Patton's Phantom Army would launch the actual invasion. The Führer's intuition, usually aggressive to the point of recklessness, was paralyzed by the perfection of Operation Fortitude's lies. For 6 critical weeks after D-Day, German reinforcements remained at Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an attack that existed only in radio transmissions and inflatable rubber. The Ghost Army continued their performance even after the invasion began. They maintained radio traffic from the Phantom 1st United States Army Group. They kept Patton visible in England for days after the invasion. They sent false reports through compromised German agents that Normandy was indeed a diversion, and the real attack was still coming. Every intelligence channel continued to reinforce the deception. By the time German High Command finally accepted that Normandy was the actual invasion and not a feint, Allied forces had established an unbreakable beachhead. Reinforcements and supplies poured across the channel. The window to drive the Allies back into the sea had closed. Military historians later calculated that Operation Fortitude's deception delayed German reinforcements by approximately 6 weeks. Those 6 weeks were the difference between success and catastrophic failure of Operation Overlord. 2 weeks after D-Day, elements of the Ghost Army crossed to Normandy and immediately began new deceptions near the artificial Mulberry harbors that the Allies were constructing to offload supplies. Ghost Army soldiers created a fake harbor at night using lights and sound equipment. They wanted German artillery spotters to see what appeared to be a second harbor under construction. German artillery bombarded the fake installation for 3 nights, wasting ammunition and revealing their gun positions, which were then destroyed by Allied counter-battery fire. The real Mulberry harbors remained untouched. As Allied armies pushed into France, the Ghost Army's traveling roadshow moved with them. Near Brest, where German forces had fortified the port city, the Ghost Army made their force appear twice as large as it actually was. They set up hundreds of inflatable tanks around the city perimeter. They broadcast sounds of massive troop concentrations through their sonic equipment. They filled the airwaves with radio traffic, suggesting 2 full divisions were preparing for assault. The German garrison commander, faced with what he believed was overwhelming force, surrendered Weeks earlier than expected, thousands of German soldiers marched into captivity because they thought they were outnumbered by phantom divisions. In Luxembourg, the Ghost Army executed one of their most dangerous operations. They needed to make German forces believe that a major river crossing was being prepared at one location, while the real crossing happened 10 miles away. Ghost Army soldiers positioned themselves near the fake crossing site, knowing they would draw German artillery fire. For 48 hours, they maintained the illusion using sonic deceptions, dummy equipment, and radio transmissions while real combat units crossed the river unopposed at the actual location. German shells rained down on the Ghost Army's position. Soldiers dove into foxholes as high explosive rounds detonated around their inflatable tanks and wooden vehicles. 9 men were wounded at Picard when a German barrage caught them in the open. This was the terrible paradox of their mission. They weren't frontline combat troops, yet they often operated closer to enemy lines than actual combat units because their deceptions had to be close enough to be detected by German reconnaissance. They were artists playing soldier, yet they bled real blood when the deception drew real fire. Private Harold Dahl wrote in his diary, "We paint lies with rubber and broadcast them with speakers, but when the shells come, they're not fooled. They're as real as anything I've ever known. Today I realized we're not just pretending to be soldiers, we're actually fighting a war with the strangest weapons imaginable." The psychological strain was immense. These were creative, educated men, many of whom had never wanted to be soldiers. They had been artists and designers and architects in civilian life. Now they lived in a strange twilight zone between combat and theater, never knowing if their deceptions were working until after operations concluded. They couldn't tell anyone outside the unit what they did. They couldn't write home about their missions. Even within the unit, information was compartmentalized. When the war ended, they were sworn to absolute secrecy and ordered never to discuss their operations. The official army report on the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was classified and locked away. It would remain secret for more than 50 years. When Ghost Army veterans returned home, they couldn't tell their wives what they had done. They couldn't tell their children. They attended reunions of other units and heard combat veterans share war stories, but they remained silent because their oath of secrecy superseded even the bonds of veteran brotherhood. Some took the secret to their graves, dying without their own families ever knowing that they had helped win the war with rubber tanks and sound effects records. The mathematical precision behind Operation Fortitude's success reveals a counterintuitive truth about warfare that military strategists are still studying 8 decades later. The effectiveness of deception doesn't depend on fooling everyone, but on creating enough doubt in the right minds at the right time. German intelligence wasn't stupid. They had sophisticated analysts, experienced officers, and systematic verification procedures. But Operation Fortitude exploited a fundamental vulnerability in human cognition. Confirmation bias combined with authoritative source validation. Once Hitler's intuition suggested Pas-de-Calais as the logical target, every piece of intelligence that confirmed this assumption was weighted more heavily than contradictory evidence. The phantom army that Jack Massey and his comrades constructed succeeded because it told the Germans exactly what they already wanted to believe. Pas-de-Calais was the obvious choice. It made strategic sense. The presence of pattern confirmed it. The visual evidence supported it. The signal's intelligence matched it. The human intelligence verified it. Each layer of deception reinforced the others in a symphony of coordinated lies that was impossible to unravel without stepping back and questioning the fundamental assumption which nobody in German high command did until it was far too late. The technical sophistication of the Ghost Army's methods anticipated modern psychological operations by decades. They understood that deception in the age of technical intelligence, had to operate on multiple sensory and cognitive levels simultaneously. Visual deception alone wouldn't work because it could be verified by signals intelligence. Signals intelligence alone wouldn't work because it could be checked against visual reconnaissance. But when every intelligence source told the same story, the cumulative effect created an unshakable false reality. The Ghost Army's sonic deception was particularly innovative. They recognized that German listening posts were trained to identify unit types by their acoustic signatures. A mechanized infantry division moving at night sounded different from an armored division. Artillery units had distinctive patterns. The engineers at Bell Labs, who worked with the 3132 Signal Service Company, created what were essentially the first military audio deepfakes, meticulously accurate recordings that could be mixed and modified to represent any type of unit in any situation. When played through their half-track mounted speakers at high volume, these sonic deceptions could be detected by German listening posts 15 miles away. Intelligence officers would mark their maps with unit positions based on acoustic intelligence that was completely fabricated. After the war, when the Ghost Army operations were declassified in 1996, military analysts began studying their methods in detail. What emerged was a recognition that the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had pioneered techniques that would become fundamental to modern information warfare. The multi-layered approach of visual, sonic signals and atmospheric deception, the exploitation of cognitive biases in intelligence analysis, the use of real authority figures like pattern to add credibility to false narratives, the coordination of deception across multiple domains simultaneously. These principles are now taught at military intelligence schools worldwide, but perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Operation Fortitude was how cheap it was compared to its strategic impact. The entire Ghost Army operation, including personnel, equipment, and logistics, cost less than a single heavy bomber. Those inflatable Sherman tanks that 4 men could carry, they cost about $100 each compared to $30,000 for an actual tank. The wooden aircraft that lined the fake airfields, built for a few $100s each instead of hundreds of thousands for real warplanes. The fake radio transmissions, they cost nothing but the time of skilled operators. Yet, this tiny investment in deception achieved what would have required tens of thousands of additional combat troops and billions in actual military hardware. Military economists later calculated that every dollar spent on Ghost Army operations saved approximately $1,000 in actual combat costs by reducing casualties, speeding operations, and forcing enemy forces to disperse rather than concentrate. The human cost savings were even more dramatic. D-Day was already the bloodiest single day of the European war, with approximately 10,000 Allied casualties on June 6th alone. Military historians who have studied the operation concluded that without Operation Fortitude's success in keeping German Panzers at Pas-de-Calais, casualties on D-Day would likely have been triple that number. The beachheads might not have been secured at all. Operation Overlord could have failed entirely, potentially extending the war by years and costing millions of additional lives, all prevented by artists with air compressors and sound equipment. The Ghost Army executed more than 20 major deception operations as Allied forces advanced across Europe. At the Hürtgen Forest, they made a depleted division appear to be at full strength. During the Battle of the Bulge, they created phantom reinforcements that drew German attacks into kill zones. At the Rhine crossing, they simulated 2 major assault preparations at false locations while the real crossing occurred unopposed. In every operation, their methods evolved and improved. They learned to position their dummy equipment at precisely calculated angles to the sun so shadows would appear correct in aerial photographs taken at specific times of day. They developed techniques for aging their inflatable tanks with mud and paint to make them look battle-worn like real vehicles. They created elaborate cover stories and had soldiers role-play officers from the phantom units they were simulating, visiting local pubs and shops where they knew German intelligence agents would hear them talking. Bill Blass, who would become a fashion icon after the war, designed fake unit patches that Ghost Army soldiers wore when operating in character. Ellsworth Kelly painted camouflage patterns on dummy vehicles with the same abstract precision he would later bring to his celebrated modernist paintings. Arthur Singer sketched battlefield scenes that documented operations while also serving as reference for creating more convincing deceptions. These artists brought their professional skills to warfare in ways the military had never imagined. The official U.S. Army assessment of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, written after the war but classified until 1996, concluded, rarely, if ever, has there existed a group of such few men which had so great an influence on the outcome of a major military campaign. Yet, for more than 50 years, their story remained secret. Veterans couldn't explain the gaps in their service records. They couldn't account for why they had been in certain places at certain times. Some were accused of having cushy rear echelon jobs when in fact they had been operating dangerously close to enemy lines. Bernard Bluestein, one of the Ghost Army soldiers who would live to see the unit finally recognized, later said, "We won the war with creativity. They gave us rubber and told us to make the Germans believe it was steel. They gave us silence and told us to fill it with the sounds of armies. They gave us empty fields and told us to populate them with phantoms. And we did. We absolutely did. That was the most important artwork any of us ever created." In February 2022, President Biden signed the Ghost Army Congressional Gold Medal Act, finally granting official recognition to the unit. On March 21st, 2024, 3 surviving Ghost Army veterans, all over 99 years old, attended a ceremony at the U.S. Capitol where they received the Congressional Gold Medal. Speaker of the House Mike Johnson read from the Army's declassified report, finally making public what had been secret for so long. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell said, "America will never forget your service," but for most Ghost Army veterans, that recognition came too late. Most had died still bound by their oath of secrecy, never able to fully explain to their families what they had accomplished. The story of Operation Fortitude and the Ghost Army is ultimately about the power of human creativity as a weapon of war. In an era of industrial warfare dominated by firepower and mass mobilization, a small unit of artists proved that imagination could be as decisive as divisions. The lessons of Operation Fortitude extended far beyond World War II, fundamentally changing how modern militaries think about deception, information operations, and psychological warfare. During the Cold War, the techniques pioneered by the Ghost Army were refined and expanded. Both NATO and Soviet forces developed elaborate deception doctrines based on the principles that Jack Macy and his comrades had demonstrated in the fields of Europe. The Soviet military, in particular, created an entire operational concept called Maskirovka, which integrated deception at every level of military planning. When the Ghost Army's operations were finally declassified in 1996, a new generation of military planners recognized that the digital age offered unprecedented opportunities for deception operations. If inflatable tanks and sound effects records could fool German intelligence in 1944, what could computer-generated imagery, electronic warfare, and coordinated information campaigns accomplish in the 21st century? The U.S. military established the Psychological Operations Regiment and the Information Operations Community, both of which use the Ghost Army's patch as an informal symbol because these modern units trace their operational ancestry directly to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The fundamental insight of Operation Fortitude remains relevant today. In warfare, the enemy's perception is often more important than ground truth reality. If you can control what the enemy believes, you can control their decisions without firing a shot. Modern military doctrine calls this shaping the information environment, but it's the same principle that guided the Ghost Army 80 years ago. The technological tools have changed, but the psychological vulnerabilities they exploit remain constant. Confirmation bias, authority dependence, the challenge of distinguishing signal from noise in overwhelming data streams. These human cognitive limitations are as exploitable today as they were when German intelligence analysts studied photographs of inflatable tanks. The Ghost Army's story also illuminates an uncomfortable truth about historical memory and classification. For more than 5 decades, one of the most significant Allied operations of World War II was completely unknown to the public and even to most military historians. The men who executed this operation were sworn to secrecy, so absolute that they couldn't correct misconceptions, couldn't defend their service records, couldn't claim credit for accomplishments that potentially saved tens of thousands of lives. Some Ghost Army veterans were criticized by their own families for having safe, rear-echelon jobs during the war. They endured these criticisms in silence because their oath of secrecy superseded personal reputation. Harold Dahl, who kept a secret diary during his service, finally published it in 1999, 3 years after declassification. He wrote, "For 50 years, I carried 2 burdens. The first was the memory of what we did, knowing it was important, but unable to explain it to anyone. The second was wondering whether it had made any difference at all. Now I know it did. Now I know we helped win the war in the strangest way imaginable. I just wish my parents had lived long enough to know what their son actually did in France." The physical artifacts of the Ghost Army's operations are scattered and rare. Most of the inflatable tanks were destroyed or lost after the war. A few survive in museums. One is on display at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, a strange artifact that looks almost comical next to real tanks, but represents a revolution in warfare as significant as any weapon innovation. The wire recordings made at Fort Knox, the sonic deceptions that fooled German listening posts, have been digitized and are now available online. Listening to them is an eerie experience. The sounds of armies that never existed, recorded to deceive enemies long dead, now preserved as audio monuments to the power of illusion. Some Ghost Army veterans continued careers that reflected their deceptive military service. Bill Blass built a fashion empire partially on the understanding that appearance shapes perception. Ellsworth Kelly's abstract paintings play with visual perception in ways that echo his wartime work, creating convincing camouflage. Arthur Singer painted wildlife with hyper-realistic detail. The same observational skills he had used to make dummy equipment match real vehicles exactly. In 2013, a PBS documentary titled The Ghost Army finally brought their story to public attention. Veterans who were still alive, many in their late 80s and 90s, were interviewed on camera for the first time about operations they had kept secret for nearly 7 decades. The relief and pride in their voices is evident. They had been validated. Their strange war, fought with rubber and sound and radio waves, was finally recognized as having been as important as any conventional campaign. Today, military planners studying hybrid warfare, information operations, and the emerging domain of cognitive security look to Operation Fortitude as a foundational case study. The Ghost Army demonstrated that a small, specialized unit using unconventional methods could achieve strategic effects far beyond its size. In an era when misinformation, deepfakes, and coordinated information campaigns are becoming increasingly sophisticated, The lessons of Operation Fortitude are more relevant than ever. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops proved that the most powerful weapon in warfare isn't necessarily the one that causes the most destruction, but the one that most effectively shapes what the enemy believes and how they respond. Jack Macy, the young art student who lifted rubber tanks over his head in English fields in 1944, lived until 2016. Before he died, he participated in the congressional campaign to recognize the Ghost Army. He told interviewers, "We were artists who became soldiers who fought with art." That's the strangest sentence I've ever said, but it's completely true, and I'm proud of it. We saved lives by creating lies. We won battles by not fighting them. We changed history with imagination. That's a legacy I can be proud of. Operation Fortitude succeeded because it exploited the most fundamental vulnerability in human decision-making. We believe what we see, especially when what we see confirms what we already expect. The German High Command wasn't stupid. They were rational analysts working with the best intelligence-gathering systems available in 1944. They had aerial reconnaissance, signals intelligence, human agents, and experienced officers evaluating every data point. They were defeated not by superior force, but by superior imagination, executed with flawless technical precision. The Phantom Army that Jack Macy and 100 other Ghost Army soldiers created was the most cost-effective military operation in modern history. For less than the cost of a single bomber, they achieved strategic effects that would have required entire divisions of actual troops. They delayed German reinforcements by 6 weeks, preventing the defeat of the D-Day invasion and potentially saving tens of thousands of Allied lives. They proved that in warfare, perception can be more powerful than reality, and that creativity can be as decisive as firepower. But the deeper lesson of Operation Fortitude transcends military strategy. It reveals something profound about the nature of truth and deception in human societies. We construct our understanding of reality from fragments of information, assembling them into narratives that make sense to us. When those fragments are carefully manipulated to tell a consistent false story, even sophisticated analysts with extensive resources can be fooled completely. This has implications far beyond warfare. In the modern information environment, where digital manipulation, coordinated disinformation campaigns, and algorithmic amplification can shape public perception at scale, the techniques pioneered by the Ghost Army have evolved from military tactics into threats to democratic discourse itself. The same principles that made inflatable tanks convincing to German intelligence in 1944 make deepfakes and coordinated bot campaigns convincing to social media users today. The Ghost Army operated under strict moral constraints. They were deceiving an enemy military to save lives in a just war against fascism. Modern information operations often lack such clear moral boundaries. The technical capabilities for deception have grown exponentially, while the ethical frameworks for deploying them remain contested and underdeveloped. Yet there's also something deeply human and even beautiful in the Ghost Army's story. These were artists, creators, people trained to see the world aesthetically rather than strategically, who took those same creative skills and weaponized them for a greater purpose. They transformed imagination into military power. They proved that creativity isn't separate from courage, and that thinking differently can be as valuable as fighting conventionally. When the 3 surviving Ghost Army veterans, all over 99 years old, received the Congressional Gold Medal in March 2024, they represented not just their own service, but a radically different conception of what military service can mean. They were warriors who rarely fired weapons. They were soldiers whose greatest battles were won with imagination. They were men who changed history, not by destroying the enemy, but by deceiving them so completely that actual destruction became unnecessary. Bernard Bluestein, speaking at the medals ceremony at age 100, said, "We created an army from nothing. We made the impossible look real. And by doing that, we helped end the worst war in human history." I'm an old man now, and I've had many years to think about what we did. I'm proud of it. Not because we were clever, though we were. Not because we were brave, though sometimes we had to be. But because we proved that humans are more than weapons and violence. We're also imagination and creativity and the ability to see possibilities that others miss. That's what won D-Day. That's what the Ghost Army represents, and that's what I hope people remember. The Phantom Squadron that won D-Day was built from rubber and wood and radio waves and sound effects. It existed more in the minds of German intelligence analysts than in physical reality, but its impact was absolutely real. It shaped decisions, delayed reinforcements, saved thousands of lives, and helped turn the tide of history. In the end, Jack Macy and his fellow Ghost Army soldiers proved something that military strategists are still grappling with today. Sometimes the most powerful army is the one that doesn't exist at all.